Why am I not a Muslim? That's a question that's often put to me by Muslim friends, especially when people find out that I have a PhD in Islamic Studies, that I've spent 25 years studying Islam, that I read the Qur'an in Arabic, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, actually, on social media recently, we had a video that I'd done on Islam go viral. Hundreds of thousands of people watched it, and one of the questions that lots of Muslim folks asked in the comments was, why is Andy Bannister not a Muslim? So what better opportunity than to film a short answer video answering that question? Why, given all I know, that all I've looked at, why am I not a Muslim? Why am I a Christian? Well, I'm not a Muslim primarily for two reasons. You see, Islam stands on two pillars. It stands on Muhammad, and it stands on the Quran. If the claims made by Islam about Muhammad and the Quran stand up, then Islam looks fairly persuasive. But I would say they don't stand up. Both those pillars on which Islam sits, Muhammad and the Quran, are very, very shaky and in fact really worthless. So let's take those one by one. Let's start with Muhammad. What are the problems with Muhammad? Well, the first problems with Muhammad are historical ones. If we want to know about the life of someone in history, we want good, written, reliable sources as close to the life of the person as possible. So, for example, in Christianity, it's wonderful that we have the four Gospels in the New Testament, all written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, within 20, 30, at most 40 years after Jesus' death. When it comes to Muhammad, though, we have a huge problem. The earliest biography we have of Muhammad was written by a gentleman called Ibn Ishaq. Ishaq died in 767. Why is that a problem? Well, Muhammad dies in 632. We have 140 years, over 100 years, between Muhammad's death and the life of his first biographer. That's a huge problem. We're outside the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. But it gets worse. We don't have the biography of Muhammad that Ibn Ishaq wrote. It wasn't preserved. It was destroyed, in fact, and we only have parts of it preserved in the writings of a later writer called Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham dies in 833. That is now 200 years between the life of Muhammad and his earliest biographer. And what gets worse is that Ibn Hisham tells us that he deliberately removed, he edited out things from the earlier biography, things which he said it is disgraceful to discuss. Things which would distress certain people, and reports that I didn't think were reliable. Well, what did he remove from the early biography? We don't know, because it hasn't been left to us. So the first problem is we really don't know what Muhammad's life actually was. We don't have reliable historical data. But then when we look at the information that has been passed down to us, then we run into the problem of Muhammad's character. And here I want to be very sensitive because I'm respectful to my Muslim friends, but I also want to be honest about what is there in the accounts of Muhammad there in the early traditions. For example, we know it's recorded that Muhammad had critics assassinated, that he had, for example, poets who composed little poetic ditties insulting him. He had many of those, and many of them were women. He had them assassinated, he had them killed. He had no time for people who criticized him. Secondly, we have the issue of Muhammadan slavery. Muhammad kept slaves, and he kept some slaves for sexual purposes. Both preserved in the Quran and in the traditions about Muhammad, we have Muhammad being given permission to use women who've been captured during the time of warfare for his own sexual pleasure. And we also know that that Muhammad was given at least one slave as a gift from another leader, Maryam, who was given to him as a concubine, as a sex slave, and he used her in that way. That raises the question of, to what extent is Muhammad a helpful example for us today? And then lastly, Muhammad also used torture. Preserved in the traditions, the early Islamic traditions, is one particular account. We read that Muhammad came across a Jewish leader called Kinana. Muhammad was told that this man had some treasure that he was holding back from the Muslims who had conquered his town. And Muhammad was asked, what should I do? What should we do with this guy who's not telling us where his money is buried? And Muhammad gave instructions that a bonfire was to be lit on this man's chest until he told his conquerors where it was that the treasure was to be found. And those are not stories we found in hostile sources. We find this in the Muslim traditions themselves. So there are huge problems with Muhammad, that first pillar of Islam. But the second reason I'm not a Muslim concerns the second pillar of Islam, the Quran. We've seen how Muhammad is very, very shaky. The same is true of the Quran. What are my problems with the Quran? Well, there are two primarily. The first is that when we look at the Quran, 25% of the material in the Quran. And that figure, by the way, is not my own figure. That comes from a Muslim scholar. Many Muslim scholars have calculated that statistic. 25% of the Quran consists of retellings of biblical material, stories from the Bible that are being retold in the Quran. So, for example, figures like Moses and Abraham and David, Jesus turn up in the pages of the Quran. But as well as borrowing biblical stories, the Quran also borrows Jewish and Christian legends. And I say legends quite deliberately. There are two in particular in the Quran. There's the Christian legend of the sleepers in the cave, which is the story of a bunch of young people who go into a cave, fall asleep, and wake up many years later and discover everything has changed. That's a Christian legend from the 4th or 5th century. But the story that the Quran retells the most is a fascinating, interesting one. It's a Jewish legend from about 100 BC, and it's known as the story of Iblis and Adam. And the story told in the Quran is how after God has created Adam, up there in paradise, God brings the angels into heaven, and he introduces them to Adam, and he tells the angels to bow down to the newly created Adam. The angels all agree, they all bow down and worship Adam, apart from one, who is called Iblis, who refuses. He says, I'm not bowing down to that. You created me out of fire, you made that thing out of clay. And for that rebellion, Iblis is cast out of heaven, and he eventually becomes Satan. Now that's a Jewish fairy tale. It's a pious legend told by the rabbis sometime around about 100 BC, just to entertain and edify people. Never considered to be history. It's not in the Bible. The Jewish rabbis didn't believe it was true. It was a fairy tale. But the Quran has retold it as if it were history. And there are other examples like this too in the Quran. Fascinatingly, a few years ago I was doing a debate, a dialogue with a very well-known Muslim apologist called Shabir Ali, and I raised this issue with Shabir, and Shabir actually is not unaware of this, and actually admitted in our discussion that yes, he believes that there are fairy tales and legends and myths in the Quran. Shabir's excuse for this, his explanation, is he thinks the Quran is using them as preaching illustrations. The problem is the Quran tells them as history. I don't think the author of the Quran knew that was not a real story. Problem number one. Second problem with the Quran concerns how we got today's Quran. My Muslim friends will say to me the Quran has been perfectly preserved with not a single change since the very beginning, but the evidence is not there to support that claim. Firstly, scholars who have actually looked at the textual history of the Quran will tell you and have shown that the Quranic manuscripts that we have today are full of hundreds and thousands of differences between them. Not necessarily significant ones, occasionally spellings or minor changes in phrase, but they are not word for word the same. Now, that goes for any ancient text from history. That there are textual variants in a manuscript tradition aren't a problem, but they are a problem if you deny them, bury your head in the sand, or worse, as Islam has tried to do, even destroy those differences. Going right back to the very beginning of Islam, Islam has always been afraid of those differences in the transmission of the Quran. One of the earliest examples of this is preserved for us in the Hadith, the early Islamic traditions outside of the Quran. Preserved in the Hadith is the story of how, during the reign of the third caliph in Islam, the third ruler of Islam after Muhammad, was a man called Uthman. He comes to the throne in 644 AD, and early in his reign, reports are brought to him by a Muslim general called Hudhaifa of how Muslim armies up on the battlefields in Syria are arguing with each other over how the Quran should be read. They have differences in the versions of the Quran they know. And Hudhaifa comes to Uthman and says, O chief of the believers, save this people before they fall into utter disagreement about the Quran. And to solve the problem, Uthman comes up with an easy solution. He puts out an order that every Quran, whether in whole manuscripts or in part manuscripts, should be brought to him, and he assigns a scribe to go through and edit them together into one authoritative version, of which 4 copies are made, and then he has every other Quran manuscript destroyed and burnt and cast to the flames. And the problem with that now is scholars therefore cannot know what the original Quran said. We can't know what the differences were that so terrified Muslims back there in the 7th century because Uthman had them destroyed. It was very controversial at the time, incidentally. Ibn Umar, the son of the second caliph in Islam, is reported to have said, let no man say he has memorized the whole Quran, because how can he know what the whole Quran was? At best you must say, I have learnt what is available of it. Meanwhile, other critics at the same time period described Uthman as the destroyer of the book. So I have huge questions about that second pillar of Islam. I think it's very shaky. I think Muhammad doesn't stand up, and I don't think the Quran stands up either. So that's primarily why I'm not a Muslim. I don't think the claims stand up. But there's one last reason I want to mention very briefly, and it concerns Jesus. You see, Jesus is mentioned in the Quran. There are 90 verses that talk about Jesus, 25 verses that mention him by name. And the Quran is very confused when it comes to Jesus, quite frankly. Firstly, the Quran is very clear that it wants to just reduce Jesus to just another prophet. The Quran says he's not the Son of God, he's nothing more than just another prophet like all the others. And the Quran attacks the Christian belief that Jesus is the Son of God, that he's the second person of the Trinity, and so on. Well, that's all very well. But then on the other hand, the Quran describes Jesus using very lofty titles. He's the Messiah. He's a word from God. He's a spirit from God. He does these amazing miracles. He has a virgin birth that no other prophet in the Quran has. He raises the dead. He does incredible healings. And the Quran implies that he will have a role in the day of judgment at the end of history. And in fact, later Islamic tradition expands on this, and as Jesus coming back at the end of history to engage in all kinds of exciting things, fighting the Antichrist, involved on the day of judgment, and so on and so forth. So you have to ask, as the reader of the Quran, which is it? Is Jesus just an ordinary prophet, or is he something really spectacular? And the simple reason there's a problem there is the Quran has borrowed Jesus from Christianity, has tried to insert him into the Islamic story, and he simply doesn't fit. In fact, I often think as I read the Quran and encounter the Quranic Jesus, it's rather like someone has taken Gandalf from Lord of the Rings and tried to insert Gandalf into Pride and Prejudice. Simply doesn't work. It's the wrong story. And the fact that Jesus in the Quran is so wrong is one final reason I'm not a Muslim. Because if you want to know why Jesus does the things that he does, if you want to really understand even some of the Quran's titles and descriptions of him, you need to go to the right story and look at the story of the Gospels and the New Testament, the historical Jesus, the Jesus for whom we have incredibly good historical evidence, the Jesus whose character stands head and shoulders above that of Muhammad, but also the Jesus who is so much more than a prophet, the Jesus who said, if you want to know what God is like, look at me. I have done. I think his claims stand up. And that is why I'm a Christian and why I'm not a Muslim.